Hey, we're going to talk about space flight today. Just briefly, we're going to explore the history of space flight, specifically American space flight, but really the entire realm of space flight is a story between two superpowers um, and the struggle between the Bolshevik revolution, revolutionary ideas and the Soviet Union, modern Russia, and our American quasi-capitalist ideas. Two major ideologies going at each other, and the Soviets were the first to take the Nazis took the first step, but then the Soviets and the American and us the Americans we took it off from there during the Cold War. Now our first steps were not all that perfect. Um, there are many launches like this. Look, nice successful launch, right? Going, sort of struggling, gimbling all over the place, and finally doesn't make it. Oh no, oh no, 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 no. Wouldn't you hate to be an astronaut on that rocket? Fortunately, there wasn't one. There were tons of these in our early years of space exploration. These mostly took place after the Soviets had already launched Sputnik in 1957, and we had many such launches where we were unsuccessful, running up to the all the way up to the all the way up to Apollo 1. So it hasn't always been a rosy picture for American space flight, and it continued to have its problems. So anyway, 1957 was the sort of the beginning of the modern space race, and so the Soviet Union launches the first artificial satellite, and I'm going to make little notes here. So Sputnik launched. Okay, so this is really what gets it all going. And Americans, the key here is that the American citizens were able to listen in on this. So all this spacecraft did was send a signal back to Earth. And it was like the Soviets were saying, look what we did. And the American citizens could pick up that signal, and it galvanized people. Um, Shortly thereafter, they sent the first dog into orbit, and a year later, we finally got our first satellite into orbit. Things happen pretty quickly. 1957, and then 12 years later, we go from nothing to 12 years later landing a man on the moon. It's impressive what happened. So 1958, NASA signed into existence, and then we move on. So the first human in space, which Yuri Gagarin, who of course the Soviets here again, and this is 1961. So this is another important um, landmark thing here. Yuri Gagarin is actually a name you should try to remember. After that, we had the first American in space. Anybody know what his name was? Alan Shepard. Okay. So that was actually, this is about when we catch up to the Soviet Union, because this is again 1961 now. All right. Oops. Better spell Alan Shepard right. Shepard. Okay. Shortly thereafter, we get the first American to orbit the Earth, and John Glenn, of course, to orbit the Earth in 1962. So, we start taking some serious big leaps now. Now, shortly thereafter, this is about the same time that Kennedy has already, President John F. Kennedy, back in 1960, actually challenges America. It's not here, it should be, but it's not. Challenges America to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Okay, that was 1960. And then we move along here, and we get the first spacewalk, which is actually Alexei Leonov, which is a Russian spacewalker. But in the midst of that, we have the first U.S. space tragedy which was the Apollo 1. They were testing out a module, and it had a pure oxygen atmosphere, and one little short circuit, and 3 astronauts lost their lives. So that was a little bit of a setback, but it was only 2 years later that the first manned Apollo mission went up. This was Apollo 7, got astronauts off the ground. Okay, and it went around the Earth 163 times. Then there was the first manned moon orbital launch. This was Apollo 8. Okay, James Lovell. Okay, that's a name you might recognize from the movie Apollo 13. That was Tom Hanks's character. And then in 1969, we do finally get the first moon landing. Now, this is only 12 years after Sputnik. 12 years. Now, this is an important one. So, I'm even going to put a date. July 20, 1969. First man on the moon. That's a big one, guys. Don't forget that one. Alright. Now, Apollo 13 launched shortly thereafter, which is Apollo 12. That's Apollo 11. Okay. We need to know that. And then Apollo 12 is launched. Apollo 13 is, of course, the ill-fated Apollo mission that never actually lands on the moon. And they have to improvise to get their way back safely. And there's several other missions, all the way up to Apollo 17. After that, the Apollo program was scrapped. Other programs that had occurred during this time are the Gemini programs and Gemini and Mercury. Mercury was the original. So John Glenn was a Mercury astronaut. We go back to the early 60s. Okay, but after Apollo, NASA's focus changed a bit. And by this time, the Soviet Union was attempting to land spacecrafts on Mars. And so that was a big deal for us. So we needed to make sure we could do that as well. There's the first rover on the moon. That was Apollo 15. The Soviet Union at the time is putting a space station in orbit. So that's the first space station in 1971. Okay. 1973, we launched Skylab, which is our first space station. And then in 1975, the first International Space Rendezvous. So we actually did something along with the Russians. This is the first instance of cooperation in space. Okay, so 1976, we land on Mars for the first time. So that's the Viking 1. Viking 1 and 2 in 1976, twin spacecraft. You know, the idea was that if one made it, great. If two made it, even better. So there was Viking 1 and Viking 2 back in 1976. I hadn't been born yet. It's still before my time. But let's see here. Voyagers 1 and 2 launched. So that's actually a major milestone, because they are, believe it or not, still sending back information to us. Those two spacecraft have left our solar system, and there's just news just a few weeks ago about how they had left the solar system, and they're still sending information back. So these are the first missions to actually visit. Mariner had previously been to Jupiter and Saturn, the Mariner missions, but then it went to Uranus and Neptune. So it was the first years of the Voyager 2 was the first spacecraft to visit, and the only one so far to visit those two planets. Jump ahead to 1981. 1981 is the first space shuttle launch. Okay, that's an important one. Okay, so this is the first reusable vehicle, and that's kind of a big deal. And you'll recognize the space shuttle apparatus, the typical, you got your rocket boosters and your fuel tank in the center, and then of course the space shuttle. And the U.S. had a bunch of these space shuttles. They've all since been retired recently, and there were over 100 of them, and many things happened. So first American movement in space. The Soviets set one up like 10 years before this. First untethered spacewalk, meaning not connected to anything. And then I remember being in school during this moment, the Challenger explosion of 1986, and that is an important one. We watched it on TV. when that was a Space Shuttle Challenger. And that was a big deal. There was a teacher on board, and so it was the first teacher. The Soviets that same year launched the Mir space station, which, um, well, it was 7 or 8 years ago, lost its orbit finally and burned up in the atmosphere. In 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope was deployed, and it's still out there, taking great pictures um, of stars, of things. It was recently uh, one of the last space shuttle missions was actually to fix it, so it should be sending stuff back to us for a little while yet. And then we started landing on Mars big time in the late 90s, Pathfinder, and John Glenn gets back to space on a space shuttle. And then we lost the space shuttle Columbia in 2003. And boy, is this where this timeline ends? Well, since then, of course, we've been to Mars several other times with different spacecrafts like Spirit and Opportunity, and among other things. And so, the overarching theme in American space exploration has been planetary. We've been exploring the planets primarily. In the future, well, there's talk of going to the moon and starting a base. Of course, we want to send people to Mars and land people on Mars. There's talk of grabbing asteroids and pulling an asteroid back to the Earth to orbit it and study it. All kinds of ideas out there. A lot of it depends on government funding. And just as an example of that, recently, the other day, the government shut down partially. And if you go to nasa.gov, you get this message. Due to the lapse in federal government funding, this website's not available. They have a great timeline of space exploration at NASA's website, and I couldn't access it, so I had to put this together. But anyway, take a moment and jot these things down. These are probably the most important things right here for you to know about. And otherwise, we'll talk some more in class. Have a great evening.